Greetings all, and today we're going to talk about the Romantic era, so the Romantics, Romantic writers, and what kind of produced this type of writing and these type of writers, spurring from what we had talked about before with the Revolutionary era and those different types of revolutions that took place in there: French Revolution, American Revolution, Industrial Revolution, and where that went from there. So, as we kind of go through this, like we talked about before, some of the end of that era revolutionary writers sort of doubled over and rode the line into the Romantic writers. So, we'll kind of talk a little bit about that as we go forward here. So, kind of jumping in here. First, starting off with some just basic ideas here. So this, I think I had this up. I think I put this up on Blackboard. William Wordsworth. So looking just kind of, he's one of the big names in the Romantic writers. 1770, 1850. So we're talking about branching over from the late 1700s all the way into the mid 1800s, and thereabouts. So. And then further for the Romantic era. So we're bleeding over from the Revolutionary era into this era. So they have overlap. So I don't want you to think that they're very specifically defined periods, because they're not. They're loose periods of time, but they are heavily defined by the writing style and what creates them. So William Wordsworth, like the gravestone that you just saw with the carving on it, William Wordsworth says, so this is his definition of what a poet is, and now mind you, during this time period. So he obviously thinks very highly of the Romantic poets, right? So he said, in spite of difference of soil and climate, of language and manners, and laws and customs, right? So it doesn't matter where they're from or where they're at physically, or what their culture is, as far as the different poets. In spite of things silently gone out of mind and things violently destroyed, because remember, these poets are post-revolutionary poets. So they have seen and just gone through and witnessed a lot of change through the Industrial Revolution, a lot of violence through either the American Revolution or the French Revolution, kind of in multiple other cultural and countrywide revolutions across the planet at this time. So they have gone through a lot of devastation. So things violently destroyed. The poet binds together by passion, which will become a major word to help us define and understand and recognize the Romantic poets, and knowledge, the vast empire of human society as it is spread over the whole earth and over all time. All right, that is saying a lot, right? The poet binds together by passion and knowledge the vast empire of human society as it is spread over the whole earth and over all time. That's quite the job for the poet. The objects of the poet's thoughts are everywhere, though the eyes and senses of man are, it is true, his favorite guides, yet he will follow wheresoever he can find an atmosphere of sensation in which to move his wings. Poetry is the first and the last of all knowledge. It is as immortal as the heart of man. So this is a tall order that William Wordsworth is putting out there for poets, and what he feels poets do and is their place in this time period. Obviously not so much as time goes on, but this is where he feels they are at then. Okay, so with that kind of in mind, that very high and mighty place that William Wordsworth has put them in. So Romanticism was arguably the largest artistic movement of the late 1700s. Its influence was felt across continents, through every artistic discipline into the mid 19th century, and I would say and beyond. heavily in Beyond, and many of its values and beliefs can still be seen in contemporary poetry. And beyond contemporary poetry, in all forms of contemporary artistry. So it gets re-dredged up over and over again, which I will kind of point out when we get to the end of this whole Prezi presentation. So I'll try to remember that. I put a picture at the end to remind me to come back to that. So we're not talking about a few. I mean, originally it was just a few artists, but that came together, but created a huge movement of the Romantics movement. But it had traction, such major traction that it was able to infiltrate across the planet and across time. That's a movement, right? That is a huge movement, to the point where probably all of you have been like, even if you don't know what it is and you couldn't name any of the poets from it, you're probably like, yeah, I've heard of this Romanticism or Romantics, even if in your mind you just think of Romantics as something schmoopy or love, which is not what it is. But even if you can't define it, it's something that you've heard of. It's something in the tip of your tongue. It's something on the edge of your mind, because it was huge, right? It was a huge thing, and that's a pretty amazing feat to be had without the internet, right? I mean, we're talking 1700s here. And that it still gets re-dredged up, and that for a small group of people that it started out as, that they were able to also smack down a previous field of writing or type of writing, which was satire, which we just got done looking at. So this is another Romantic writer. This is Percy Shelley, which we'll read some pieces by him. Also, interestingly famous for who would later be his wife, Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley, also a Romantic writer, and interesting because she was female, but she wrote Frankenstein, which was considered a Gothic novel. So it is difficult to pinpoint the exact start of the Romantic movement, which I was just saying. So it's kind of, mid 1700s somewhere to mid 1800s somewhere. As its beginning can be traced to many events, multiple events. So later we'll get to a folklore section, which we're not doing right now, but we will after the whole Romantic section, because they kind of intertwine, and it becomes a part of or a branch off of the Romantics, because it kind of stems from it. So a surge of interest in folklore in the mid to late 18th century comes off of this, with the works of the Brothers Grimm, which we'll talk about later in the semester. Reactions against neoclassicism and the Augustan poets in England. So part of that means that as each time period, as we move forward, they seem to constantly push against whatever came before them. So for the Romantics, who had just gone through as a group of a generation of people, especially the younger to mid 20s, 30s, and maybe even early 40s, had just gone through a huge upheaval of living between the violence of the revolutions and even what I would call the violence of change through industrial revolution, right? So much of it positive through invention and change of, modernization, but also that brings a lot of what is often called violence of change, right? All that, what we had talked about before, right? The poor in the street, the problem of disease and plague that comes with it, because of poor living conditions, poor working conditions, which is why we have the revolutionary writers looking for better rights for people and workers and etc. So all of that clash of changes that had not been there before that, which some of them had seen both sides of it, some of them came in later because of their youth. So this becomes a reaction against that classic feeling of how things should be versus the change, which we still kind of had that before, right? In Enlightenment, we had the progressives against the classics, The and this is still the same. It's still the same thing, just with new names. It's often rebranded, right? So the new classists, we have the neoclassicisms, where they're still trying to reinvent themselves in the old ways, but in a new century. And the romantics are pushing against that, saying no, all of these old ideas of rules and decorum have to go. These have to go, because remember, we talked about those very specific and structured extreme ideas of decorum in all facets of life, including and especially in art and literature. They pushed against that. They're like, no, 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 no. This has got to go. This is out the door. We're done with this. And it also sprung from political events and uprisings that fostered this nationalistic pride in this time period, which we saw some of in what we were calling the revolutionary writers, where they were, for country and for rights and standing up for human rights and workers' rights and women's rights and child rights, which was not something we saw in Enlightenment, right? So a lot of changes that were different from before, moving forward from before, but fostered still from what we saw before, because without that whole idea of enlightenment to rise up against things, to question things, to push against things, that natural change for revolution would not have been there. So the Romantic poets, what was important to them? And there's a couple of different slide pieces that talk about this. So when you're working on assignments, which I always have multiple assignments that talk about how can you look at a poem and understand if it is from the Romantic era, if it is from a Romantic poet, or if it's a more modern poet but has maybe influences from the Romantic era. How do you know that? How can you tell that? How do people look at those and say, well, clearly this has some sort of influences from the Romantic era? I mean, you hear people say things like that, and you're like, well, how do you know that? This is how they know, because there's usually very specific tenets or elements that are particular to each type of era that they have cordoned off. So this is some of those. So you would probably want to write them down. They were heavy on individualism, where in Enlightenment era they would be more likely to and certainly pre-Enlightenment pack together and be more about social, be more about crowd, be more about society bound. Because of Enlightenment, people became more individualized, thinking more about self first. So think about the end of Candide, right? They started out, everything happens for a reason, everybody is together, it's all works as a whole world element created for one specific reason that we can't understand. By the end of Candide, we get to this whole idea of, you know what, just tend your own garden. Just forget about everything else out there. Tend your own garden, because that's what's going to save you. That's what's going to help you. Worry about yourself. So we come back to this idea, think for yourself, worry about yourself, do things for yourself. We become this whole, especially in the Western thinking, in the Western world, quickly start moving to this idea of individualism, both in a very positive way and sometimes in a very negative way, right, as we move forward. So it has positives and negatives, as does both sides, right? A more socialistic society has positives and negatives. An individual society has positives and negatives. So individualism becomes heavily sought after in the Romantic poets. They become more isolated. They create more in isolation. They don't create their work in group environments anymore. They tend to go off by themselves. So it's much more individualized, reflecting upon things as an individual instead of as a culture. Reverence for the natural world. Now, there are multiple different outlooks on that. It's like many things that I've read about the Romantics. I've read many things that said, yes, they had a reverence for the natural world. And I've read a few things that said, that's kind of, that idea is not necessarily across all the poets, which none of these ideas are across all the poets. We're talking about generalized. So if not reverence for the natural world themselves, like they may not all go, oh, I love nature. It's not necessarily that they all love nature and that they're looking for how nature rules the world. Some of them do. Some of them, it's about how nature has affected them and how they work within nature. So let me give you an example. It's the difference between looking at how spring is, and thinking about how spring has shown us the beauty of the world and all that kind of thing. That's having a reverence for the natural world and the natural working of things. And remember, we had talked about before the change in spirituality, where some people looked at nature to understand God, right? So this is a progression in that for some, right? Still this kind of spirituality through nature, right? Being closer to their own spirit and spirituality through looking at nature. They were not all like that. Some of them were more about being able to inner reflect, have some kind of inner reflection of themselves by being in nature. It didn't mean that they were going around and touching the leaves and stuff and going, oh, spring or something like that. But they needed to be alone and they needed to be out in nature by themselves. Like some of them wrote out by lakes. Some of them liked to be in the forest. Some wanted to be in the desert. It just depended on the individual poet. But being isolated in the natural world is what helped them inner reflect. So their reverence for the natural world wasn't so much that they were looking at it to understand life, but so much that by being in it, it helped them understand their inner world. So that's a little different, all right? So you kind of had two different ways to think about how the Romantic poets dealt with the natural world. Some looked at it from inside out. Some needed it to be in it to help them look at the inside, outside, in. Yeah, that was confusing. Sorry. Idealism was important to them, so not necessarily realism. That will come later. This was not a time of realism. It was a time of idealism. So what they wanted, what they thought of, a whole different outlook. Physical and emotional passion probably was above the rest. And like, I'm going to repeat myself a couple times as we go through the rest of this because it depended on who was talking about it. Passion really should be at the top of any list for the Romantic poets. Their personal, individual outlook to pour out their feelings, passionate, very, very emotional, passionate views of things, and their physical, passionate, descriptive pieces, excuse me, is what becomes very like an earmark for the Romantic poets, which will be very different from a lot of the other writers. As you'll see when you read Kubla Khan, okay, these kind of all appear in Kubla Khan, which is a trip all by itself. And an interest in the mystic and the supernatural. That's not all of the poets. That's not all of the supernatural. That is not all of the Romantic poets. This is kind of a side branch of the Romantic era. So just like all of the eras of writers, just like the Enlightenment writers had a group that went to satire and a group, that went kind of to dark comedy. They didn't all do that. There's like through the Romantic writers, there's like a side branch that went to the kind of the mythic and supernatural, and within that group, a group that went dark to the Gothic. Okay, so we got ended up with Poe in there, right, and obviously Bram Stoker, and a whole group that even some that dabbled over there, like even some of the female writers would write a Gothic novel. Gothic novels became very popular, even of like the romance Gothic novels. So not all of them wrote here, but they did have a lot of them did touch the mystic, looking for that spirituality, right? Which sometimes came from this natural world piece, because they may not all have been religious. A lot of them were not, but they were spiritual. So it depended on where they were going with that. And again, I'll refer you back to when you have to read Kubla Khan. You will see most of that in there. Maybe not the Gothic piece. So the Romantics set themselves in opposition to order and rationality of classic and neoclassic artists' precepts to embrace freedom and revolution in their art and politics. So there was one place where I saw that it said that the Romantics created art for art's sake. And part of that came from like the end of the revolutionary pieces, but that was not always the case. It's like there is some out there, and I do feel like Kubla Khan feels that way, where you read it and at the end you're just like, why? Where it's more of a trip through somebody's, well, it's a trip through somebody's trip. That's what it is. But you feel like it's a trip through sensations. It's a trip through experiencing. It's a trip through experiencing. So when you read something or even look at something like a piece of art, a painting, a sculpture, and you're trying to understand the emotion of it, the passion of it, that's an art for art's sake, right? It means it doesn't have a didactic purpose. It doesn't have a lesson in it. Some of the Romantics pieces were like that, but they were not all like that. Some of it was most definitely still political. Some of it was most definitely still a teaching moment for something, whatever it was they were trying to get across. A very large portion of them were still trying to get some kind of a meaning across, whether it was for about women or about relationships or about politics or about the poor. They still had pieces in there they were trying to draw attention to. So once you start drawing attention to a problem or an issue or something you want to say, you have moved away from art for art's sake. So it's not all like that. But definitely they pushed against the kind of neoclassic classical ideas of, trying to set out a very structured, rationalized, specific storyline, in that kind of piece, where they had to be in these real tight knit structures that were laid out before. So that whole idea of decorum, they hated that. So they busted it out. They busted it out of there. It was gone. They hated it. I put this picture up here of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust. I did not make you read that this semester. I'm not going to make you read that. Once in a while I do. It's very long, but it is an interesting story. And you've probably seen or heard or watched or heard references to Faust. And it's that old story that they retell 1,000 times in many different versions in 1,000 different movies. It's that selling your soul to the devil for something that you want, right? But in the end, the devil gets his dues, right? You got to pay the devil his dues. If you're going to sell your soul for something, because you want whatever, fame, fortune, or in this case, knowledge, in the end, you have to pay the devil. So there are different versions, and even Goethe had there like a couple versions where the devil the devil wins, or the main character wins. He outsmarts the devil. So it just depends on what version you read. And this was, written in the 1700s, late 1700s, early 1800s. So all of that after that, right? I mean, it all comes from here. It all comes from Faust and Faustus. So, and this is German, written in from Germany. So think about all the times you heard that type of story. So it's all just kind of a general derivative ripoff from this. So it's not an easy read, and it's rather long, which is why I don't force it. There are, I think, I don't know if the full book is in our book, but there are chapters of it. So if you ever want to go back and read it, it's worth the time, but it is time consuming. So it's like I felt like I had to pick one or the other, so I choose Candide. So some of the just basic kind of romantic poets got going on here. Schiller, and like I just said, as far as the German romantic poets, and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, which I was just talking about. British, William Wordsworth at the beginning, like I was talking about. Samuel Coleridge, which you'll do, Kubla Khan. Percy Shelley, which I think I give you a piece from. Lord Byron, who was really good friends with Percy Shelley. Keats. So they propelled heavily the Romantic movement. And Victor Hugo from the French, I mean, there's tons of them. It's like we have tons of them listed in our book. But basically, this whole Romanticism crossed the Atlantic through the work of American poets. Also, Walt Whitman. If you ever take American Lit from, I think, who teaches American Lit right now for us? If you take American Lit, but if you take it through Kiwi, he loves Walt Whitman. He's a big Walt Whitman fan. Edgar Allan Poe, huge American romantic poet and writer, and he's of the Gothic nature, obviously. So it just depends, but it was a huge spread, right? We're already just looking at 4 countries or more here, but it went further than that. Okay, so it produced many stereotypes also, right, that we still kind of think of today when we're talking about poets, that kind of tortured, melancholy, visionary, right, that lonely poet. I must go off by myself with the kind of the sad face and the lonely heart, and like the black sweater and all that kind of stuff. It kind of comes from this era, this romantic poet, because they did go off by themselves. It was kind of their thing. They were so individualistic. Their creative process was they went off alone. It's not like they didn't all come back together and talk and stuff, because they did in groups. But their creative process was that they had to be alone, and they went off by themselves, and always had this like tortured soul, that whole piece going on, and always sad kind of thing. Romantic ideals never specifically died out in poetry, ever, and still don't. It still exists in like through music, but were largely absorbed into the precepts of many other movements as we go forward. But traces of Romanticism lived on in French symbolism, but in a lot of other things as well. It never really fully was stomped out. It still kind of goes on. It still kind of goes on. So again, kind of those basic characteristics, giving you like an extra idea here. Defining the nature of Romanticism. Their primary importance is the free expression of the feelings of the artist. So again, this is a huge breakaway from anything that went before it, where everything had to be put into very specific rhyme schemes, very specific ideas, very specific genres, right? It's like, if you remember before, it's like you had to have the appropriate topic fit into the appropriate poem type or document type, or expressed in the proper way or you wouldn't get published, and you needed to do it with the right type of exact, meter and rhyme, or forget about it, and you had to do it in a specific way, and language use and all this kind of thing. It was very, very structured, and they're like, no, we don't like that. This structure, they felt that the structure was like being in some sort of poetry jail. So they sought to free the poets from poetry jail and felt that you should have free expression of those feelings. And they kept using this term over and over again, that the importance of untrammeled, which means no interference. All right, untrammeled feeling, no interference, is, who said that? Caspar Friedrich, that the artist's feeling is his law. Untrammeled feeling. So, in other words, your creativity should not be perverted too much once it's hit the page. Now, the reality of that is probably very different. So, kind of here's kind of how this went. The Romantic poets would have us believe, and now this is me being sort of I don't want to say snarky, but this is me being a little skeptical on their creative processes. Okay, normally in a poet. So let's go back to Enlightenment, and now of course they had a lot more rules in Enlightenment writing. But in Enlightenment, you would write something. If you remember back to the Rape of the Lock at the beginning, the introduction, he's a little ticked off in the introduction because he's saying, well, this was not meant to be published yet because I still needed to edit it more. So since it got out there, and he writes this little bit at the beginning because somebody pre-published his piece before he had finished editing it. So the Romantics felt like that should have never been an issue because you shouldn't be editing your work, all right? Which is silly, but that's how they felt. That would be untrammeled. That would be trammeling your feelings. They felt like a good poet should be able to just kind of, for lack of a better term, throw up all your feelings onto a paper, and it should somehow come out beautifully with very little mucking about there, and it should be, if you're a good poet, it should be this work of art. All right? The artist's feelings are law. It's his law. So, in particular, when you read Kubla Khan, his whole idea, if you read the whole thing, which you're supposed to, you'll notice that partway through, if you read the little piece before you read Kubla Khan, there's like this whole explanation of what happened when he wrote it. That he was in a dream state, which is code for he was heavily under the influence of opium. He was in a opium state, and he wrote the first half of it, and that somebody came to his door, and he got up and answered it, and when he came back to finish the other half of it, he couldn't get back to that exact space, let's say. So that sort of hazy dream that he was kind of in, he lost track of it and couldn't get back to it. So the rest of it feels different. So you'll notice that when you read it, that it does in fact feel different, the rest of it. Because he'd been kind of, woken up out of his revelry of his haze. And he tried to get back to it, but he could not. So it doesn't flow very well for the rest of it. But it is what it is. So he would have you believe that all of this is just thrown out there for the first time. He just wrote it as is and never touched it or edited it or tweaked it or fixed it, and poof, there it went. He just wrote it, and there he put it up, and it's been this poem that we've read ever since. I don't really think that, I don't believe that, but that's the Romantic poets wrote by themselves, so there's no way to ever prove that that is part of their creative process, but supposedly that is how they wrote. Untrammeled feelings, okay, we'll just have to go with that. This is a picture of Samuel Coleridge himself. So basic characteristics again, as a rule, the influences and models from other works would impede the creator's own imagination, so originality was absolutely essential. So before the Romantics, how would people learn how to do things? And I'm not just talking poems here. I mean anything, because the Romantic movement was beyond poetry. It was poetry, all kinds of literature, short stories, novels, painting, everything. So how would somebody learn how to be an artist of any kind before this? You would study with the masters, right? That's what you would do. And usually when you studied with the masters, you would first paint the masters. And you would learn how to do that. You would learn their work. You would learn their strokes. You would learn their sculpting, expertise. You would learn their writing expertise until you understood it well enough to start to be able to develop one of your own. That was an apprenticeship. That was what you did, right? That is not how the Romantics felt you should do things at all. They're like, no, you should not be influenced by any model of any other work because it will impede your own creative imagination. It would therefore become what they would call derivative. Derivative means it looks like you had an influence from somebody else's work. If it's derivative, it's garbage. Everything had to be original, which is also why they hated anything that fit into tracks or fit into forms. If it fit into a form and it fit into a track, it's garbage. It's all garbage, right? So for them, the concept of genius or artist was able to produce his own original work through this process of creation from nothingness. It's key to Romanticism, and to be derivative was the worst sin, right? So if they looked at it and said, this reminds me of Shakespeare, garbage, right? And like for us, in modern times, this sort of reminds me of Stephen King. Well, great, I want to read that. They would be like, garbage, right? It's derivative, garbage. The idea is often called romantic originality. So it had to be 100% original to them or it was garbage. So now think back to Kubla Khan again. If you read it before you watched this, or when you do read it, think of how it is just so weird and it's all over the place. It doesn't fit into any form or anything because they were super like death on this whole it better be original. Okay, it was original, that's for sure. So that's part of their whole thing, right? To be part of the Romantic poetry era, it had to be original. Very difficult to do in our modern time, but I guess for them, when there wasn't that much published yet, perhaps they could pull it off. And they were really weird. It was really weird, some of it. So very out there. Yeah. And again, there was a lot of opium going around, so there was that. All right, in literature, Romanticism found reoccurrent themes in the evocation of criticism of the past, the cult of sensitivity, with emphasis on women and children, the heroic isolation of the artist or narrator, and respect for a new, wilder, untrammeled, and pure nature. So some of their themes that you may see while you're reading some of the Romantic literature and pieces is they constantly chastise the past. They're very critical of the past, which I would say that's a reoccurring theme for every generation and for every period that we ever study in any class, is they're always very critical of the past, right? Hindsight is 2020. It's very easy to say, well, they should have done when you're not the one that was in it. So we will see that theme always. We will always see that theme. So they are very critical of the past. This cult of sensibility, where they feel like they are more sensible than anybody in the past was. This is what should be happening now. This is what we're going to look at. But definitely we have a new emphasis on women and children in the Romantic writers that we did not have at all an enlightenment, right? Because an enlightenment, remember, we often talked about the complete and total absence of children in most of the writing, because of course they felt that they were not logical as a child. You do not have the ability to be reasonable yet, which is not true, but that's what they felt at the time. So therefore, we have nothing to do with you. Women, they often felt the same way. We are often categorized as, equal with children. Women can't be reasonable or logical, so we're just not even going to deal with them either. So women were often left out of a lot of the literature and stuff too, until the very end of Enlightenment, which starts to cross over with revolution and mix in with time period wise, and mix in with the Romantics, where we have Mary Wollstonecraft, who happens to also be the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein and is married to Percy Shelley. So, it's a small writing world, really, at that time period. So you'll also see the heroic isolation of the artist or narrator. So back to that, woe is me as the lonely soul that writes for you, right? The compassionate writer alone in writing, the tragic writer. A respect for a new, wilder, and untrammeled, pure nature. So the idea of before, in older times, Enlightenment and before, where there was this fear of nature and this idea, especially, and we see it a lot in British, a lot of British literature, where they were always trying to control nature, reconfigure streams, redo trees and replant the way that trees were in rows, and reconfigure all the hedges and stuff to make sure everything was in some very specific patterns and geometric patterns. So the control of nature was very important to them. And now in the Romantics, they're like, no, we don't want to do that. Nature should be let alone. Let it be free. Let it be wild. Stop changing the riverbanks. Stop changing the way that the forest grows. Leave those hedges alone. And they had this huge change in respect for the wild, right? The changes of the wild. And that's reflected in some of their writing, depending on who's writing. So, last but not least, so we're at our last bit here. So this is not a Romantic writer from the Romantic period. This is a more modern day, so let's say 2015-ish. Although this picture is not from 2015, but the band was. I want to say this is, I can't remember if this was Coleridge's, a house that belonged to Coleridge or Wordsworth. I'd have to look it back up. This is Ville Valo. He was a lead singer of him, and he had actually bought this house. I want to say it was Coleridge's. It could be Wordsworth. I mix them up sometimes. But notice that he's kind of dressed like Coleridge, the picture of Coleridge. In fact, it smacks heavily of the same picture that I just showed you of Samuel Coleridge. His band, a lot of bands in like the 80s actually had a whole movement of bands called the New Romantics, where they were heavily influenced by the Romantics. And then there's still bands in the mid-teens of the 2000s that had the same thing, where especially if they speak a lot about relationships, or themselves as the tortured souls, or how they're alone in the world, they may reach back to a lot of the tenets of the Romantics. So it is still something that is heavily alive and well in our modern day quote unquote poetry, which is for us more through music. So it is most certainly something that is modern day influences for us still, and in other types of art as well, like definitely in our literature. We still like our supernatural side in our Gothic side, which is still heavily influenced by that time period as well. So it's not gone by any stretch of the imagination, which is why I have you guys read Dracula. So literature, furthermore, like I was just starting to talk about, several romantic authors like Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne based their writings on the supernatural, occult, and human psychology, which was just really getting going at the time. Obviously, now we know a lot about human psychology comparatively, but then it was human psychology was like underneath the heading of supernatural and occult, which is kind of funny. But that's where it was, because they're like, human psychology, what are you talking about? That's like the occult. And it's like, so now it's science. But at the time, people thought they were crazy talking about human psychology. So they were very interested in this whole idea of the human psyche, but it got bulked under really talking about the supernatural and the occult, because people thought of it almost as witchcraft. So it was very interesting looking at it. Romanticism tended to regard satire as something unworthy of serious attention, and that was an interesting prejudice that actually is still with us. It's like because the Romantics were so influential in their time, so influential across so many countries, because they hated satire so much, which is so weird, but they did. I mean, it was because it was so popular in the end of the Enlightenment, and they hated everything that was Enlightenment. Everything that went before them, they trashed. Satire got trashed, and they hated it. So they hated satire. Of course, satire is very fixed, right? Satire is something contrived. You have to think about it. You have to really place it in to your writing. It's not usually something that's just untrammeled passion that pops out of your mind. So it wouldn't fit with their writing style of the Romantics. And since it didn't fit with their writing style, they trashed it. It is not worth serious attention. It's garbage. So they trashed it so bad during this time period, which was like, 100 years, that it has just about not been able to gain its legs again. It has been stuck down in like a comedy spot, and had a difficult time regaining itself. It's been slowly but surely trying to pull itself back up from the depths of sad comedy there, but it's getting there. So the Gothic novel began with a piece from Horace Walpole that you'll probably never read, but it's called The Castle of Otranto from 1764. Important precursor to one strain of Romanticism, delight in horror and threat, which we definitely carried forward and still heavily carries on the shelves. Exotic, picturesque settings, right? Which was like Walpole's castle, and has a role in early revival of Gothic architecture, because at the time Gothic architecture was like gone. So because the castle in that story was such a prominent piece, and other Gothic novels also, the castles and the manors and all that kind of stuff were such prominent pieces in the stories. There became this huge want for new pieces being built that carried that Gothic architecture with it. All of a sudden, there was this huge revival of Gothic architecture for new buildings during the 1700s and the 1800s. It's why they started calling it a Gothic period, a Gothic writing, because of the architecture, not because of the writing style. But then we start thinking of the writing style as Gothic because of the architect. It's kind of funny, but it was really about the architecture. It was really because the castles in the background, the scary buildings in the background, which then brought forth a whole new set of building styles and a revival of that building style. But then we think of it as this dark and scary thing. All right, so Bram Stoker's Dracula also is in that genre, obviously, and a lot of Poe's writing and other writing. So we carried that forward, and all of this came from this Romantic period. So I hope that kind of pulls this Romantic era, what was important to them, how they saw it, why they went this route, and And I hope now you can hear the words romantic era and romantic writers from this era and not think to yourself, oh, they wrote love stories. No, they didn't. That's not what this was about at all. And that this kind of helps you